The book of 2 Kings, we're starting to get near the end as we are in chapter 20. Breely left 3 months ago, something like that, I don't know. And you probably thought we'd be done with 2 Kings by now, but we're still in 2 Kings. We are in 2 Kings chapter 20, where we're looking at some more about Hezekiah's reign. Last class we had together here in 2 Kings, we were able to look at the first 11 verses of chapter 20, where we saw this extension that's given to Hezekiah. You might recall in those particular verses that King Hezekiah was sick unto death, and he received initially a word from the Lord that he needed to get his house in order because he was going to die. And what was Hezekiah's response to that news? He prayed, right? He prayed to God and asked God to remember him ultimately. And as we talked and kind of looked at a little bit of the layout of the king's palace and the temple and everything that was there, it would have been probably tops like 10 minutes. And that's being very generous probably. From the time in which Isaiah had left Hezekiah's room and gotten almost basically to the middle of the court, and now he gets a word from the Lord to go back into Hezekiah. And what's the message he's taking to Hezekiah now? You got 15 years, right? I'm going to add 15 years to your life, but it wasn't just an addition of Hezekiah's life, but there's also the assurance that God was going to deliver them from the Assyrians. And so all of that was taking place, and we see this great moment in King Hezekiah's life. Hezekiah, of course, at the end of that section, he said, well, how do I know, right? What's the sign? And then you have that situation where basically God makes the time move back. If God can make the time move back, then of course he could extend Hezekiah's life by 15 years. And so that's where we left off in our last class. But let's keep moving through chapter 20, where now we're going to see the Babylonian visitors in verses 12 through 19. In this particular section, we find ourselves kind of going back to some of Hezekiah's faults. We've been noticing along the way that Hezekiah is a very good king. We noted early on when we first started looking at Hezekiah that he is one of the few kings that's actually mentioned as being a king like David, that he followed in David's way. But now we're going to find where it is that there is still some shortcomings here. We already saw with Hezekiah the first time he dealt with the Assyrians that he would try to just pay them off instead of dealing with them as he should have. Now we're going to look and see how it is that he deals with these Babylonian visitors when they come. And so when the visitors come, it starts out with the tour that Hezekiah gives them. If somebody could read for us 2 Kings chapter 20, verses 12 and 13.
Baladan, king of Babylon, sent letters and a present to Hezekiah, for he heard that Hezekiah had been sick. Hezekiah was attentive to them and showed them all the house of his treasures, the silver and gold, the spices and precious ointment, and all his armory, all that was found among his treasures. There was nothing in his house or in all his dominion that Hezekiah did not show them.
When you look in these verses, we see sort of the rough time frame based on verse 12. It's at that time, and so right there, after which Hezekiah had been sick, and then he receives this extension to his life. During that time, the Babylonian king, Baladan, is going and sending this letter and these presents to King Hezekiah. For what reason? He had heard that Hezekiah had been sick. Now, at least what this shows us is that the Babylonians at least had some respect for Hezekiah. Because what they ultimately knew about him, how much they had been in contact before, I don't really know. But obviously there's enough respect that the king of Babylon wants to send to him these great presents. We don't know what specifically the presents were, but it would have been coming from a king with this particular envoy that's sent would have been most likely something very, very nice. But it wasn't just this respect that's there. If you look back in some history, you see that this was a common practice of different nations to try and send these types of presents to kings of foreign nations, especially whenever they were trying to gain allies for particular battles or wars. And Josephus, the Jewish historian, he actually says concerning this particular event that this was what was taking place. That you had the Babylonians sending these gifts to King Hezekiah because they wanted to make Judah an ally with Babylon against the Assyrians. And so right now what we're starting to see is there's going to, at some point before too long, be a power shift. That there's already other nations starting to make their play to be the next top dog, where Assyria has been for quite a few years now. That now you have these bigger nations starting to pop up that are starting to make their push. And so you have the Babylonians sending to Hezekiah, wanting Hezekiah on their side. And then we'll notice how Hezekiah is going to respond to some of this here in a moment, but I saw Jared's hand and then Johnny.
You can see some of the details in some of those exchanges going back into 1 Kings with Solomon and his reign, the Queen of Sheba, or even some of the others that were sending tribute almost back to them, and some of the amounts, pretty mind-blowing of what these nations would send to another king.
Yes.
And then oftentimes the king that received it would then try and even send more back with them to show their appreciation to them. And
we catch maybe a little bit of a glimpse of maybe not what he's wanting to send right now, but at least a picture of, hey, if we do this thing, look at what all I have to offer, kind of a situation. And we'll talk more about that in a second. Johnny?
I was just going to say, God had just helped them to defeat Sennacherib. So sure, they would want them on their side. They would be a strong ally.
And of course, there would have been a recognized history about some of the very unlikely victories that the people of Judah, the people of Israel had. And so I like how you bring that up, thinking about how God's the one who gave them this victory. God delivered them. Of course, he's going to deliver them from the Assyrians. And you look, though, at how Hezekiah handles the Babylonians when they come. Did you notice anything about verse 13 that maybe stands out? He showed them everything in his kingdom, right? And I want to emphasize his. You look through verse 13, and does that little possessive pronoun his kind of stand out to you? Right, if you look and you read verse 13 again, think about what it is. After Hezekiah receives the letters and the present from the king of Babylon, verse 13 says that he was attentive to them and showed them all the house of his treasures, the silver and gold, the spices and precious ointment, and all his armory, all that was found among his treasures. There was nothing in his house or in all his dominion that Hezekiah did not show them. Exactly.
So he's still keeping them at arm's length while still showing them something.
Yeah, there's maybe a little bit of it there, right? But the recognition in that is that Hezekiah sees it as his, right? But really, whose is it? It's God's. And so evidently there's this little bit here in Hezekiah of a sense of pride. Now we've seen this in some of the other kings. And this, again, gets back to seeing some of the shortcomings in Hezekiah, that yes, while he is a good and a faithful king, there are still some faults that are there. And of course, we realize the humanity in that, because we may be very good people, but at the end of the day, we still have our faults. We still have our shortcomings. And so Hezekiah, in the situation, maybe it could have been good politically for him to align himself with the Babylonians politically, but he didn't need it, did he? Because who had already told him that he would give him the sure victory over the Assyrians and over his enemies, just based on the previous section? It's God. Yet here we have Hezekiah welcoming the gift from the Babylonians, welcoming the present, welcoming them in to his house, and then beyond just his house, but into his treasury, into his armory. He was essentially not leaving anything to their imagination. He's showing them how great his kingdom is. maybe there's mention there about God, but just based on the text, everything seems like it's Hezekiah talking about how great Hezekiah himself is. And so we have to see what's taking place in all of this, because that's going to affect the way in which the Lord is going to respond to Hezekiah for the way that he deals with these Babylonians. I see your hand, David.
Yeah, he was just confirming to the Babylonians what was going to be theirs in the near future.
Exactly.
They knew what he had, where it was, and let's go get it.
He was going to make it easy for them. And that's the message that he's about to get, is that all the stuff they just saw is about to be theirs. And so let's move into this next section, and let's look at it of the Lord's message in verses 14 through 18. Would somebody read those verses for us? 2 Kings chapter 20, verses 14 through 18.
Then Isaiah the prophet went to King Hezekiah and said to him, "What did these men say, and from where did they come to you?" So Hezekiah said, "They came from far country, from Babylon." And he said, "What have they seen in your house?" So Hezekiah answered, "They have seen all that is in my house. There is nothing among my treasures that I have not shown them." Then Isaiah said to Hezekiah, "Hear the word of the Lord. Behold, the days are coming when all that is in your house and what your fathers have accumulated until this day shall be carried to Babylon. Nothing shall be left, says the Lord. And they shall take away some of your sons who descend from you, whom you will beget. And they shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon."
So even as David just recognized there that what Hezekiah was doing was essentially just showing them where to go when they come. And so now you have Isaiah bringing the word of the Lord to Hezekiah. And I find it interesting the way that this situation begins, because Isaiah comes to Hezekiah with two questions, right? What are the two questions? What did they say and where are they from? And how many of the questions does Hezekiah actually answer? Just one of them. Only where they're from. Hezekiah was either trying to hide it or trying to be deceptive about it. And really, I guess they're both the same type of a thing. But Hezekiah only answers the question about where they are from, recognizing that these men had come from a far country, that they came from Babylon. Yet Hezekiah does not tell Isaiah about what was discussed. Now, Isaiah himself may not have known, but God most certainly did. And that would play into what the particular response of the Lord is to the situation. Isaiah goes on to tell Hezekiah about what's going to happen, about how because Hezekiah had shown the Babylonians everything that was in his house and all of his treasures, and so Isaiah tells him, based on the word of the Lord, that everything that was his was no longer going to be his. Because who would it wind up in the possession of? The Babylonians. And of course, with that, to see just how much they would take, the Lord says that nothing would be left. I'll get to you in a second, Johnny. And then not only was it going to be the possessions of the wealth and the gold and the silver and all of that type of thing, but what else were the Babylonians going to take? They would take sons that he hadn't even had, but beyond that, they would take generations, if you will. Because what was going to happen to the sons when they're taken into Babylon? They would be eunuchs. That there'd be no chance of furthering the line after that for the family and those who were taken and made eunuchs. This is what was going to happen. Even if we look ahead, and this does take place, you get to the end of 2 Kings, and at the end of 2 Kings, what we find is that it's actually the Babylonians who come, and they take out Judah. They take Judah captive. They're going to certainly take all of the riches that are there within the city and within the king's house. But even if we go to Daniel chapter 1, in Daniel chapter 1, we see where it is that even some of the king's sons would be taken at that point. So even as the word of the Lord said, it would come true. Daniel chapter 1, and we can just start looking together in verse 1. And it says, "In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the articles of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and he brought the articles into the treasure house of his God. And then he goes on in verse 3 to see where Nebuchadnezzar instructs Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel and some of the king's descendants and some of the nobles, young men in whom there was no blemish, but good-looking, gifted. And of course, we could read on from there, but that's where we see Daniel and Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah being taken into Babylon. But I bring all of that up to show that the word of the Lord is sure. That just as God says it would happen, it happens. But for Hezekiah, how might we expect him to respond to this?
Oh, no.
We would think there'd be a little bit of some sorrow, a little bit of fear, maybe a little bit of how can we change this? Because already when Hezekiah's gotten some difficult news, how did Hezekiah respond to the difficult news in his life before? He prayed. He went to God. But we're going to see that he responds to this situation a little bit differently, which maybe again points to some of his issue with pride. Let's look at his acceptance of these things based on verse 19. Somebody could read that verse for us.
So Hezekiah said to Isaiah, "The word of the Lord which you have spoken is good." For he said, "Will there not be peace and truth at least in my days?"
Hezekiah doesn't show the sorrow. He doesn't show the regret, but more so he just shows resignation, we might say. He says, based on these things that are said, that it's good. The word of the Lord is good, and it certainly is. Maybe this is Hezekiah at least realizing that this is the right thing to happen. But then Hezekiah keeps talking, and at least the New King James says, well, will there not at least be peace and truth in my days? The English Standard Version here, instead of saying peace and truth, says peace and security. And I think that's maybe the better rendering of this, because it helps us realize what Hezekiah is saying. Hezekiah is saying in this moment, the word of the Lord is good, and I'm not going to have to deal with these things during my life. Right? I know I just got an extra 15 years, and this is me kind of paraphrasing a little bit, obviously. But Hezekiah is saying, well, I just got another 15 years, and I know the Lord's going to deliver us from the Assyrians and all of these things. And maybe it is the case, yeah, the Babylonians will come and they'll get my gold, they'll get my silver, they'll take some of my sons away and make them eunuchs, but I won't be here to see it. I can enjoy my treasures and my house and my kingdom and my dominion at least for the next 15 years. Maybe that's kind of exaggerating some of what's taking place. But nonetheless, we've already seen Hezekiah's character, and we've seen that he knows that success comes from humble prayer. He knows that these things can be changed in his life when it is that he shows humility before God, when he repents, when he prays. But right here at this point, Hezekiah just simply says, so be it. Will there not at least be peace and security in my days? Do we ever have an attitude like that in our life? That, yes, we have care and concern for our family, for our children, for our grandchildren. I realize that. But is there not ever a moment perhaps in our life where we kind of look ahead in the future, or we look and see things that may be coming, or maybe very real possibilities down the road, and maybe our attitude is, well, it won't be in my day.
But if you think about it, there's no way you can change it. I don't think that he thought that God would grant him that, since he just gave him those 15 years. Maybe he thought God, that was enough.
And that's very possible, because that's kind of the way that a lot of times, of course, we'll look at it, is that, well, nothing's going to change. But do we think that he thought he ever would have gotten an additional 15 years? Or when he's shut up like the bird in the cage from Sennacherib, when Sennacherib surrounds the city and he goes in and lays it out before the Lord in the Lord's house, did he think that it was possible that the angel of the Lord would come down and kill 185,000 in one night to deliver them from the Assyrians? Impossible things can take place through prayer, But whenever we start to look at it more from the physical perspective, that's when it is we start to think, well, nothing can be really done about it. And at least it's not happening in my day. You see, all of this is coming up in Hezekiah. You look at the way that the Kings, the writer of the Kings records a lot of this history, that it's like everything seems to be going good, and then there's sort of this down. And then maybe things start to look up again, and for Hezekiah, things are looking really up. And then how does he end the recording of Hezekiah's reign? On another big down. You see, all of these things are showing the problem with the people, the problem with the leaders, the problem with the ruler, that none of these particular men, none of these kings were ones who were going to really be able to save the people. We're going to get into a couple of bad kings when we get to chapter 21, and then after that, we'll return to another good king, but it's another good king whose life ends very abruptly because of ignoring something that the Lord specifically said not to do. And so we look at these things, and what we have is this continual reminder that these kings are not the Savior. That you can't put your faith, you can't put your hope, you can't put your trust in these kings, that it all has to be in the Lord God. And so Hezekiah, that's where we see really the end of the specifics of his reign, is when it is that these Babylonian visitors came in, and now he finds out that they're going to take it all. They're going to take his sons to Babylon, make them eunuchs. And Hezekiah just says, well, will there not at least be peace and truth, or peace and security in my days? Johnny?
I'm going to say this should be a warning for us.
Mm-hmm.
That no matter how much good we do and how much we try to follow God's word, we're still not immune from temptation and pride.
That's right. And that's going to be really one of the big lessons, one of the takeaways that I have at the end. And so we'll kind of circle back to that here in just a minute whenever we're kind of thinking back through the chapter with some of these big lessons. Let's look at verses 20 and 21 now, where we'll see the end of Hezekiah's reign. Let's just start, if somebody could, read verse 20.
Now the rest of the acts of Hezekiah, all his might, and how he made a pool and a tunnel and brought water into the city, are they not written in the books of the chronicles of the kings of Judah?
So as we've seen with each of the kings along the way, there of course was more that they did in their reign, and they could go back in their history and look at these things and see it, but it's not history that we have access to today. We know what we need to know about them. The Spirit has revealed those things to us through the Word here. But in this particular verse, there's a mention even of Hezekiah and the rest of his acts, about the pool and the tunnel that he made that brought water into the city. We brought this up back in chapter 18 about this particular tunnel, but here are some more pictures of it. This is Hezekiah's tunnel. That what they did was basically went through, there were some crews that started outside the city, one started in, and they basically just tunneled until they would meet each other. This was about a 1,750-foot tunnel is what this particular situation is, where Hezekiah was able to take water from outside and reroute it and divert it down through these tunnels to bring water into the city. And a lot of this is done because of the attack that was coming from the Assyrians. Read you some of the history on it about this particular tunnel system. Let's see. Hezekiah was able to ensure a steady supply of water into Jerusalem through this tunnel when the city was under siege by the Assyrian ruler Sennacherib in about 701 BC, thus saving the city from almost certain destruction. The water was redirected into Jerusalem from the Gihon spring through this underground tunnel that was cut through solid rock for 1,750 feet. And so that is an engineering wonder. Even today, I think one of the things we talked about, Velda, I think you were the one who kind of brought it up about thinking about just how impressive that is, that they didn't have, all of the type of like boring drills and everything else that we would be using today to do this, but they're down there with hand tools making it happen. And it's certainly one of the great feats from Hezekiah's reign. And then let's look at that final verse, verse 21, where we'll see his death and his successor.
So Hezekiah rested with his fathers. Then Manasseh, his son, reigned in his place.
So Hezekiah passes away, and then Hezekiah's son Manasseh will become king, and we'll look more at Manasseh in chapter 21, and looks like we'll have some time that we'll at least be able to start talking about Manasseh here in just a minute. But before that, we have our takeaways from chapter 20. The first one is never underestimate the power of prayer. Thinking about Hezekiah and the news that he received that he was going to die, that he was not going to get over that sickness, that he needed to set his house in order, his initial response was that the Bible tells us he turned to the wall, and then we see him pray that prayer to God. And like we talked about with that particular prayer of Hezekiah, when you look in chapter 20 and in verse 5, that is a very short prayer. That is a very simple prayer, that there are not all sorts of kind of like prayer lingo and phrases that if you don't say it just right, it's not going to happen. There weren't all sorts of things like that. It's just a simple prayer from Hezekiah's heart. And like we talked about, if you just sit there and say that prayer, read out loud what Hezekiah said, it really doesn't even take you 15 seconds to say it. Less than 15 seconds of a prayer adds how much to his life? 15 years, right? Prayer is powerful. Never underestimate the power of prayer. And then, Johnny, this is what you were starting to bring up just a moment ago. When we look at Hezekiah's life, right here at the end, we have this warning about pride. That everything can be going well, that we can see God's power and His providence. We can see His working in our life. We can see the victories that He gives. But that doesn't mean that we're immune to our temptation. And that doesn't mean that we are not at risk of pride. Hezekiah was a great king. He was a faithful king. Hezekiah knew who God was. Hezekiah, at many times in his life, was very humble. But in this moment, when the Babylonians came in, and then just based on the response to what's going to take place, Hezekiah had fallen prey to pride. I came across a quote from someone talking about Hezekiah's pride and making connection to us. He says that pride makes us rob God of the glory that belongs to Him alone. Pride gives us a feeling of false security, and this leads us into sin and defeat. Thinking about how pride robbed God's glory, or how Hezekiah's pride robbed God of His glory. When the Babylonians came and Hezekiah showed them these things, whose did he say that the riches and all the things in the armory and all of the kingdom, who did Hezekiah say that it was? It's mine, right? Right? You look at the text and everything is about how it's Hezekiah's. It's Hezekiah's, right? His. But nothing about how it's actually God's. What a great opportunity that would have been to show these pagan individuals, these Babylonians, about the glory of God instead of the glory of Hezekiah. And even then, looking at all of those things, as Hezekiah is saying, well, it's mine, it's mine, it's mine, it's mine, think about the false sense of pride. That maybe even for ourselves, if we look at the things that are in our possession, if we start to look at the things in our possession as actually being ours instead of being His, think about the false sense of security that can give. Well, I'm okay. We start to be like the rich fool who said, well, I'll just tear down these barns and build bigger, right? That I don't need to worry about helping others because, well, I've got all this for me and I'm ready for when it comes for me. Well, beware of pride. The third lesson here, and this is just kind of an overarching lesson from chapter 20, really from the reign of Hezekiah, really out of everything we've been seeing in the book of 2 Kings, is the fact that God is in control. The way that we've said this before is to realize that God is sovereign. Thinking about Hezekiah's life at the beginning, God is sovereign over Hezekiah's life. Hezekiah prays, and God blesses him with an extra 15 years and takes that particular sickness away. Then you look at the Babylonians, and the Babylonians come, and the word that comes to Hezekiah is the Babylonians are going to take control. They're going to take your riches, they're going to take your kingdom, they're going to take your sons. Who's in control of that? God is. even when we went to Daniel chapter 1 and read a few of the verses there at the beginning, maybe you noticed whenever we read through those verses the mention about how the Lord gave them into the hands of the Babylonians. God is fully in control, and that's an important lesson to always keep in mind. And so that is 2 Kings chapter 20. Now if I can get my notes up here for chapter 21, we'll go ahead and move into 21 and start looking at these two evil kings. We just got our introduction to the first of the two evil kings at the end of chapter 20, and that would be Hezekiah's son, whose name was Manasseh. And Manasseh was quite the evil king. As one individual put it, Manasseh was to Judah as Ahab was to Israel. And so he is a very, very, very wicked king. But let's look at this overview of his reign that's going to be in verses 1 through 9, and I'll read these verses for us. Manasseh was 12 years old when he became king, and he reigned 55 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Hephzibah, and he did evil in the sight of the Lord, according to the abominations of the nations whom the Lord had cast out before the children of Israel. For he rebuilt the high places which Hezekiah his father had destroyed. He raised up altars for Baal, and made a wooden image as Ahab king of Israel had done. And he worshipped all the host of heaven and served them. He also built altars in the house of the Lord, of which the Lord had said, in Jerusalem I will put my name. And he built altars for all the host of heaven in the two courts of the house of the Lord. Also he made his son pass through the fire, practiced soothsaying, used witchcraft, and consulted spiritists and mediums. He did much evil in the sight of the Lord to provoke him to anger. He even set a carved image of Asherah that he had made in the house of which the Lord had said to David and to Solomon his son, in this house and in Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, I will put my name forever. And I will not make the feet of Israel wander any more from the land which I gave their fathers, only if they are careful to do according to all that I have commanded them, and according to all the law that my servant Moses commanded them. But they paid no attention. And Manasseh seduced them to do more evil than the nations whom the Lord had destroyed before the children of Israel. It's not every chapter that we see with these kings that the kind of summary of their reign takes up the majority of the chapter. But that's exactly what happens with Manasseh. The majority of this chapter, the first half of it really, is all pointing toward this summary of his reign before getting into any of his specifics. And what we see just based on the summary, and if this is a summary, then we know that it doesn't cover everything, but it gives us a clear enough picture. He was a bad guy. Geraldine?
I just had a couple of questions. So it says that whenever he started reigning, he was 12, and then I know it says that he reigned 55 years. Do you think, and all these questions are kind of run together, so I'm going to just hit you with all of them. So would he have started being so evil, like as soon as he got in, like as soon as he became king, started doing all this? Because if so, I mean, his father was not this evil, horrible example to him. So I just wonder, whenever he's that young, is there people kind of at his side influencing him to be this horrible, do these horrible things? Or would it have been like 55 years down the road is when he started being so evil? I don't know, why are you so evil if you had good examples and you...
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And I'm glad that you noticed that with kind of the age and trying to think about how's that happen. Because like you say, Hezekiah was a very good king. He was faithful. And so, we would think based on that, he would be teaching his son. And even based on what his son would have seen and what his son would have known of his father's reign. Of course, Manasseh wouldn't have been alive early on in Hezekiah's reign whenever he goes in and destroys all of this from the land. And whenever he restores true worship there, he wouldn't have been alive for all of that, but he would have known. So most likely what it is that there would have been some advisors, there would have been some counselors within the kingdom who probably remembered what it maybe had been like before. Maybe it's because of the situation that came in with the Assyrians that some of these counselors are saying that was a little bit too close, right? That was too close of a call. Okay, maybe he protected Jerusalem, but what about Lachish, right? They got taken out by the Assyrians. So maybe their thought is, well, we need to start trying to do this another way. And so they're all going to kind of be telling him what to do. You're going to see something similar when we get to Josiah in the next chapter. Josiah becomes king when he's 8.
Right.
But very similar, Josiah is the contrast here. Josiah does the right things.
Right.
And so, when exactly some of this starts to happen, don't know if it's right there at the start or if it's a few years down the road, but it at least had enough time in his life to characterize everything. And Manasseh's a very interesting one because of what happens at the end, and we'll talk about that. We don't have time to get into that this morning, but Lord willing, in our next class, we'll be able to kind of look at that and think about it, because even there's going to be some lessons, like you say, thinking about Hezekiah. One of the lessons we learn right here is that you may be a great parent. You may teach your children and show them what it looks like to live a life of faith, but they may not always follow in your footsteps. With Manasseh at the end, we're going to see that he lived a wicked life. He gets it right at the end of his life, but that did not help his son Ammon any. Ammon didn't follow in the good, but instead followed after the evil. And so a lot of good parenting lessons that we can take from it. Let's see your hand, Jared.
And also, kind of tie into that, the last we're told of Hezekiah is that, yes, his life is going to be extended, but also we see the pride creeping in his life in that same time frame. And then those last 15 years, we're just not really told a whole lot about that. So a lot could have changed with him, even with the pride that was already festering within his heart here in those 13, 12 years, of Manasseh's early life.
Well, and looking at it, thinking about it, if it's 15 years that get added to Hezekiah's life, and Manasseh is 12 when he becomes king, then who was not alive when the 15 years were extended and granted? Manasseh. So, Jared, to your point, we don't know what happened after all of that, but the indications are that some pride had crept in. So we don't know how much of the good influence may have been there. And, even thinking about that and about the opportunity that Hezekiah had that may have been wasted in those 15 years, when he was told to set his house in order at the beginning of chapter 20, who would become the next king was not even alive yet, right? So he had, in the 15 years, time to kind of help mold and shape his son. Of course, at 12, he was still going to need help from some of the advisors and counselors. But if those advisors and counselors would have encouraged Manasseh to do these wicked things, even right out the gate, however that came about, why did Hezekiah leave them in that position? There's a lot of wonder and question about it. But what we see is he was an evil king.
Just kind of going off of what some things that they said is, a lot of times we'll see things in our parents that we don't want to repeat.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe that's one of the things he saw in his parent, he didn't want to repeat, but then are we really willing to fight against it? That's something that maybe it's a trait that we've inherited as well, tend to be somewhat prideful, tend to be whatever the case may be. And we see that in our parent, and we don't want to repeat that, but we're not willing to put the work into it to fight against it ourselves.
Yes.
So we become the same way.
Yes.
It's not like, oh, well, that's just how it is, and that's just how I am. No, we're just not putting the effort forth to combat that and to pray to God for that help to overcome those different things.
Yeah, very, very good point there. That he may not have wanted to become it, but he became it, and then some. He was multiplied, and the wicked and the evil was amplified. But yeah, so many good things, and I say that. So many good lessons we can learn. There were not a lot of good things that happened in Manasseh's life and in his reign until we get to the very end. But at the outset, we see already a lot of a contrast between he and his father Hezekiah, a lot of contrast between the good, and now we're looking at the wicked. And we're not going to be able to get into all the specifics of it this morning, but we'll, Lord willing, be able to talk more about the specifics of this summary overview of his reign next week. And so thank y'all for y'all's attention, y'all's comments and questions this morning.